David Torevell studied theology and English literature at the University of Hull, and then he did a master's in philosophy in theology and education at the University of Birmingham before completing his PhD in theology and religion at the University of Leeds. He went on to do a PGCE in religious education at the University of Liverpool. David worked as a teacher in Catholic secondary schools for 18 years before entering higher education to teach religion, philosophy, and education and English literature. He was Associate Professor in Theology and Education at Liverpool Hope University, and then he moved to Leeds Trinity University, where he is currently Honorary Research Fellow. David is a prolific and an amazing scholar, and he's published over 70 books and articles. He's senior editor for the 11 volumes of the Liverpool Hope University series in ethics. He has published widely in the areas of education, Catholicism, theology, literature, and philosophy, and his most recent edited books are Literature and Catholicism in the 19th and 20th Century, 2021, which he edited, and another volume, New Insights into Literature and Catholicism in the 19th and 20th Century, which he edited with Paul Rowan. He is working on a book on sport and religion, which we hope is coming out in April 2022. It's to be published by Routledge. And we are honoured and delighted to have him as a visiting professor to the Irish Institute for Catholic Studies. So a big welcome to you. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you very much, Trish, for that lovely welcome and introduction. This lecture is a much smaller version of an article which I've just had published in the international journal called Religions. So this is a sort of summary of that longer article, which is Carla will make available to you if you choose to read the full text. So the naked truth, temptation, and the likely fall of Catholic education. This lecture highlights the likely fall to which Catholic education is susceptible in the modern era, in England and Wales particularly. In arguing for this position, our biblical hermeneutical method oscillates between two seminal texts about people's temptation to elevate themselves too highly. One is written, Genesis 3:1-18, and one is visual, which you can see on the screen, Masaccio's The Expulsion. We suggest that this narrative is particularly appealing because it deals honestly with key debilitating aspects of the human condition, namely pride, loss, shame, and guilt, but at the same time does offer a redemptive way out of these entrapments through the humility to ask for forgiveness. The American Jewish literary critic Greenblatt argues that the story of Adam and Eve continues to enrapture readers and listeners from across and beyond the boundaries of religious traditions due to its mirroring nature. He writes, for reasons that are at once tantalizing and elusive, the few verses of the story of Adam and Eve in an ancient book have served as a mirror in which we glimpse the long history of our fears and desires. This has been both liberating and destructive, a hymn to human responsibility and a dark fable about human wretchedness, a celebration of daring and an incitement to violent misogyny. This lecture has got 4 parts to it. 1, a universal story of envy, pride, shame and loss. 2, focus on the painting itself, the fresco, The Expulsion by Masaccio. 3, a little focus on St. Augustine's insights into the texts. And I use this as a contrast to modern educational thinking about the turn towards the autonomous self. Fourthly, shame, hiding, and the possibility of forgiveness. And fifth, the likely fall of Catholic education in the light of the text and the fresco, and how they might inform that argument about a fall. So, part one, a universal story of envy, pride, shame, and loss. The Jewish and Christian seminal account of Adam and Eve's sin in Genesis 3:1-18 is essentially an anthropological narrative concerning who human beings are and to what they are dangerously susceptible. As a universal text with a timeless significance, it appeals to all humanity, not simply Jews and Christians. We are critical of those postmodern writers who suggest such universalism is ill-advised, and we unashamedly disagree with this contention. Along with the Professor of English at Oxford, Terry Eagleton, we insist that religious thinking and text posit a common humanity easily identifiable. As he writes, rather wittily, a God who concerned himself only with a particular section of the species, say Bosnians or people over 5 foot 8 inches tall, would appear lacking in the impartial benevolence appropriate to a supreme being. Biblical texts have the advantage of being timeless and pertinent to all cultures and histories. The dramatic story has been traditionally known as the fall of humanity and involves 5 characters: God, Adam, Eve, the devil, and the cherubim, who become embroiled in a personal and cosmic battle. Much Jewish and Christian life and theology rests upon this spiritual warfare, the consequences of which can either be redemptive or devastating. The narrative does focus on the importance of obeying God's commands and staying in a loving relationship with him, and exhorts the living of a virtuous life through the following of God's will, not our own. The dangers of pride, envy, self-aggrandizement and rivalry are signalled throughout the dramatic story, as it explores these human traits in a highly dramatic manner. The word Adam comes from the Hebrew noun Ahadama, which means earth. Readers are reminded how the Lord formed man of dust from the earth, Genesis 2:7. A theological truth about humanity's mortality and creaturehood. Unequal to God, humanity's challenge is not to be in rival with him, with others, or with ourselves. The author of Ecclesiasticus echoes a similar warning. Do not exalt yourself, or you may fall and bring dishonour upon yourself. Surely atheists, agnostics, and religious people alike recognise this commonly felt temptation at self-elevation. The word naked, arum, is mentioned 4 times between Genesis 2:25 and 3:11. And the man and his wife were naked and were not ashamed, 2:25. Then the eyes of both were opened and they knew that they were naked, 3:7. Adam, and I was afraid because I was naked and I hid myself, 3:10. God, who told you that you were naked, 3:11. Why is there this emphasis of nakedness in Genesis 2 and 3? One possible answer revolves around the association between nakedness and truth in the Christian tradition. Christians are encouraged to be naked and truthful before God. In other words, to be frankly honest to their creator. To give one example from philosophy, the great French mystic Simone Weil, truth is not revealed except in nakedness, and the expression the naked truth is used commonly in much discourse, she adds. Revelation itself is frequently described as unveiling the truth about those things which were previously hidden or concealed. Nakedness also has a clear association with shame, the genitals, and sexual desire. The Greek word adoia means genitals and is a derivative of the word eidos, which means shame, and similar terms are in fact found in other languages. Eidos is the Greek goddess of shame and modesty. Although the Genesis text does not explicitly state that Adam and Eve's fault was of a sexual nature, the forbidden tree is, I think, symbolic of temptation and sexual desire. After eating the forbidden fruit, Adam and Eve feel shame and guilt and become scared as they hear, quote, the sound of the Lord God walking in the garden, panicking that they might be seen by him, which is the reason why they hid. Williams, the previous professor of ethics at Oxford, argues that this common reaction to shame is, quote, to cover oneself or to hide, and people naturally took steps to avoid the situations which called for it. Those in the 17th century who covered over Masaccio's painting of Adam and Eve's nakedness with fig leaves due to the scandal it might cause exhibited this same tendency to associate nakedness with shame and sexuality. The fig leaves were removed in the 1980s, and the painting is now as Masaccio originally painted it. I shall have more to say about the notion of shame a little later. The question we might ask ourselves is, has God banished Adam and Eve, or have they banished themselves? Whichever view we take, Masaccio certainly paints verses 23 and 24 with dramatic intensity, as you can see. It is only with the coming of Christ that a realignment becomes possible. Masaccio uses a vast amount of space and shadows on the fresco to represent the rough ground on which Adam now stand, and this reflects verse 3:17. Cursed is the ground because of you. In toil you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it shall bring forth to you. The biblical scholar Richardson comments that the expulsion is no, quote, arbitrary divine decree, but the fact that the woman and man is now unable to live in paradise. They made God's good world a place of strife and rivalry, and the road to redemption is long and steep. So now I move on to saying a little bit with some art historians' assistance about the fresco itself. The expulsion by Masaccio is based on Genesis 3:23 to 24. Therefore the Lord God sent him forth from the Garden of Eden to till the ground from which he was taken. He drove out the man, and at the east end of the Garden of Eden he placed the cherubim and a flaming sword which turned every way to guard the way to the tree of life. It was painted sometime between 1425 and 1427 in the Brancati Chapel in the Church of Santa Maria del Carmine in Florence, which has become known as the Sistine Chapel of the early Renaissance. The fresco sits alongside his other work, Tribute Money. Masolini, who was the teacher of Masaccio, also has the temptation of Adam and Eve opposite. But as the art historian Cole Owl comments, there's a striking difference in the two artists' portrayal of the couple. Quote, the courtly elegance of Masolini's Adam and Eve contrasts paradigmatically to Masaccio's huddled, weeping figures. Their soft, pearly flesh serves as a foil to the vigorously modelled sculptural anatomy of Masaccio's progenitors, a visual encapsulation of their prelapsarian indolence on the one hand and their toil after their expulsion on the other. Vasari, the 16th century biographer of Masaccio, suggested that he freed himself from Giotto style and brought in a modern style which began to be copied many times over since his death. Masolini's and Masaccio's other paintings cover the walls in the chapel, and these represent the life of St. Peter. Masaccio was a student of Mussolini and 21 years his younger, born in a small town just outside Florence. His name, Masaccio, means clumsy Tom, because he took no interest in his appearance, people, politics. He was absolutely focused on his art. Two major influences apart from Giotto were the architect Brunelleschi, from whom he learned linear perspective, and the sculptor Donatelli, whom he imitated in paint with his sculptural depictions of figures like Adam. Masaccio died in Rome at the age of 26, some say by poison administered by a rival artist, some say by the plague. The expulsion is the first a visitor sees as they enter the chapel. On the left, high up, as the visitor enters the chapel. What is the expulsion doing here? Does it suggest that the church, led by St. Peter, offers the grace required to counter the fall? Perhaps. It is painted on what is known as Bruon plaster, and Masaccio would only have been able to paint small sections each day, otherwise the plaster would have been too dry. But there is a sense of four-strained movement echoing the verse, "Therefore the Lord God sent him forth from the garden. He drove out the man." In the painting, they do appear to be pushed out of the garden. Even the rays of light, now dark over time, seem to steer them away just as much as the angel steers them away. The painting does convey, I think, a trajectory of culpable expulsion. From the left, innocence and joy in the garden, to the right, toil and pain on the earth outside. The heavy vertical line of the gate, Carla, are you able to put that? Thank you. As well as the menacing sword of the angel, seem to prevent re-entry. They are truly banished. The sword and rays of light to the left of the painting, aside from giving a feeling of rushing movement and a directional pushing out of Adam and Eve, would have been originally silver, representing the glorious world from which Adam and Eve had been expelled. The bright red unfolds of the angel's garments and the carpet on which he lands are in stark contrast to the darkness of the earth. The sword acts as an incentive to banishment and a barrier to re-entry. The 17th century devotional writer St. Francis de Sales, in his treatise on the love of God, interpreted this verse about the sword as the need for everyone to be pierced by divine love in order to live the Christian life. For him, the sword was a symbol of redemptive pain, and Masaccio's fresco, for some viewers, will carry this hopeful message. The angel's body is foreshortened, which allows Masaccio to compress the body to allow the eyes to think it is looking at the person from a distance. Such compression creates a sense of depth or three-dimensionality. The artist wishes to indicate that this destiny-changing incident is taking place in a definitive time and space, and does communicate feelings of intense loss. Like a frozen freeze from a film, the artist captures the precise moment of guilt-ridden exposure and expulsion. The architectural features of the gates and the emotional impact were most likely influenced by Giotto's work. But whatever we think about the painting, the fresco, I think most critics would say Masaccio has created a stunning visual effect, a colourful and dramatic scene of displacement long before computer-generated imagery. Eve is modelled on Venus, the Roman goddess of love and sex, the Greek equivalent to Aphrodite. Like her, she covers in modesty her breasts and genitalia. She has a contrapposto posture, the Italian word for human beings standing with most weight on one foot and the other relaxed, which causes the hips and shoulders to rest at opposite angles. The most famous examples of this are Michelangelo's David and Botticelli's The Birth of Venus. The stance gives the impression that the character is ready to move on quickly when necessary. Adam and Eve seem, it seems to me, as if they are in transit to another location, which is clearly what Masaccio was attempting to do by his use of this technique. The depiction of the bodies and gestures of the Edenic couple highlight their nakedness, and in fact by doing so Masaccio does contradict the earlier verse 22. The Lord made for Adam and Eve and his wife, Adam and Eve, garments of skins and clothe them. Masaccio seems to want to portray their exposure and shame. Adam's body is muscular and tensed due to his anxious state of mind and his inner turmoil. The covering of his face suggests his psychological torment, whereas Eve displays the agonizing despair of her face. Light shines on both bodies from the right to expose their guilt and shame. The vanishing point is situated on their torsos, which focuses onlookers' eyes on their naked bodies. Back to Greenblatt. Masaccio's unforgettable figures depend on their overwhelming sense of embodiment. Adam's right foot still touches the threshold of paradise, but not for long. They are in the world now, and unlike the angel who possesses wings, a beautiful garment, a sword, and a kind of magic carpet, the humans are utterly unprepared. They are entering a very harsh environment, and they have nothing whatsoever to shield or protect them. From this perspective, Adam's penis, strikingly central to the fresco's composition, once the overpainted fig leaves were removed, is less a sign of his virility than of his being what Shakespeare calls unaccommodated man. His Adam and Eve were no longer abstract, decorative emblems of human guilt. They were particular suffering people who had bodies with volume, weight, and above all, movement. End of Greenblatt quotation. Clifton makes the illuminating point that in the 15th century, there were, of course, deeply entrenched attitudes towards gender difference, very much at odds with arguments about gender fluidity which rage today. Masaccio would have been aware of these, and maybe he exploits them. Is he attempting to suggest ironically, as many do now, that sharp distinctions between genders are no longer helpful or valid? Although Eve's sin that led to the fall is not actually specified as a lapse of her chastity per se in the text, what is developed in Western Christianity is certainly association of sin with sexuality, and this owes much to the scriptural portrayal of the primeval couple. What developed over time was a relenting blaming of Eve for her role in tempting Adam. Masaccio's image reflects the association of shame and nakedness, and by extension sexuality, in the figure of Eve. Can we put that on, Carlitus? So, thank you. Only providing for Adam a different gesture, which also signifies his shame, but of a very different kind. By portraying Eve's gestures of covering her breasts and genitalia, Masaccio identifies her sexuality as the location for her sin and shame. Of course, it was widely recognised at the time that women's bodies were sites of provocative and alluring temptation, and that women were innately unable to control their emotions and bodies. In contrast, Adam covers his face, not his body, and since his visage was associated with the mind at this time, Masaccio is indeed suggesting that Adam loses his mind during the fall and a corresponding contemplation of God. It has very little to do with the control of his body. He loses his manliness due to his unreasonable behaviour. Clifton points to the late 14th century handbook for artists by Cennini, which discusses human proportions. The work claims that males possess proportions, but females do not, and are therefore like irrational animals. Is it any wonder that Adam feels so bad about himself, a man losing his manliness? What more shameful thing is there to endure then or now? Men in the 15th century and beyond were discouraged, as they are now, from public displays of emotion in keeping with their presumed rationality. Thus Adam hides his face lest he demonstrates unmanly emotion. Eve, on the other hand, wails openly and publicly, a gesture of shame centered on her body and provocative sexuality. Might it be too far-fetched to suggest, it probably is, that since Masaccio was so aware of the nonsense of entrenched gender differences and stereotypes that he painted these two figures ironically to highlight this absurd notion? Was Masaccio the first female feminist and the first in the history of painting to be aware of the reality of gender fluidity? The next section, Augustine versus postmodernists, turn towards the autonomous self. Augustine writes that since there was no prior evil in the garden, the door of pride let it in. Adam and Eve succumbed to the belief that they will be like God if they eat the fruit of the tree. They had forgotten they were dust, and unto dust thou shalt return, Genesis 3:19. They forsook the foundation on which their minds and hearts ought to have rested, St. Augustine writes, and they opted instead for their own foundation, blatantly raising themselves even above the divine. Augustine defines the nature of their pride, quote, "And what is pride but an appetite for a perverse kind of elevation? Enjoyment and rest consequently became turmoil." As the great contemporary Trappist monk Dom Eric Varden writes, he's my favourite spiritual writer at the moment, about this text. By acting as he did, Adam preferred his own criteria to those of his maker. He who at first had stood face to face with the flaming countenance of God, whose being reflected God's glory, yielded to presumption. He thought he subsisted at God's level by some quality intrinsic to himself. The tempter's trick was to speak of God as being jealous of man. If the ruse worked, it was because Adam, at some level, did consider himself God's equal. End of Varden quotation. Augustine, as you probably know, became obsessed with the book of Genesis throughout his life and spent 15 years writing the literal meaning of Genesis. And he dealt with it again in The City of God. I think the story of Adam and Eve, and many people have suggested this, became for him a way of understanding his own and others' people's struggles with will and desire. It became an incessant problem for him throughout his life, probably enhanced by the intense guilt he felt about his 13-year relationship with his lover before his conversion. The toil each person endures outside the garden partly consists in the battle between uncontrollable desire and will, and it is a lifelong struggle. This is the curse. Augustine refers to voluptuous thoughts he often had at the end of his life in his monastic cell. He was only human like you and I. Masaccio captures with intensity this sexualized sense of shame and toil. The enduring question Augustine asked himself was this: why is it impossible for the will to control desire? His answer was that the spiritual battle only came about after the fall. Desire was not in opposition to the will in the garden. As a Neoplatonist, Augustine believed that it would have been perfectly possible for Adam and Eve to have had, quote, unlustful sexual intercourse had they not fallen. However, they sinned before this took place. They would not have had the activity of turbulent lust, in their flesh, but only the movement of peaceful will by which they commanded the other members of the body. He writes, how happy then were the first human beings, neither troubled by any disturbance of mind nor pained by any disorder of the body. They incurred the penalty of exile from paradise before they could unite in the task of propagation as a deliberate act undisturbed by passion. Thus Adam and Eve's disobeying of God's command was all the greater, says Augustine, in proportion to the ease with which it could have been avoided, precisely because their desire was not in opposition to their will. But they had still free will. The conflict between selfish sexual desire and the will came about only after the fall. For now, the flesh is in such a condition that it simply cannot serve our will. And it was right to be greatly ashamed of this lust, and it is right that the members which it moves or fails to move by its own right, so to speak, and not completely in accord with our will, should be called shameful, says Augustine. He had his answer to his questions, or so he thought. After the fall, everything changed. Adam and Eve saw for the first time what they had never seen before, that they were in fact naked, and it filled them with shame and impelled them to reach for fig leaves to cover as a veil. For when grace was removed and a punishment commensurate with their disobedience inflicted on them, Augustine writes, they appeared a certain shameless movement of the body. They became victims of involuntary desire and voluntary arousal for satisfaction. Up until the fall, the Edenic couple had lived in perfect freedom. Now outside the garden, they lived imprisoned by their own proclivity to succumb to desire, lust, and the wiles of the flesh. This is not only the Edenic couple's proclivity, but of course every person is suggesting Augustine. And this tendency was passed on through each generation. All forms of addiction, sexual, alcoholic, gambling, drug, are susceptible to uncontrollable desire, which the will seems totally inadequate to resist. And desire features strongly in the Genesis account, and the tree becomes a symbol, sensuous allure that, quote, was a delight to the eyes, and, quote, to be desired, Genesis 3:6. Time is getting on. I better get on to quickly a short section, the way of redemption, shame, and then I want to talk about Catholic education very quickly and draw all the threads together, but I'm very conscious that time is going on. So something about shame and hiding. The Jewish author Zornberg, drawing from Midrashic sources, comments that after the fall, Adam and Eve's existence shrinks and they lose all stability as they move out of the garden. Adam, she says, is now spineless, of vapidity. A splendid being decomposes before our eyes. The statue represents this collapse through Adam's downward gaze, his face hidden and buried in his hands. Shame often results, says Augustine, in isolation, in de trinitate, and I think the painting is a representation of feelings of shame that we can all identify with. In De Trinitate, he comments that the soul slipped away from the shared whole to its own restricted parts. The two figures no longer have any direct eye contact between them. And what is worse, they have to endure the loneliness on a brutalized earth, or as the narrative puts it, thorns and thistles it shall bring forth. And there is a real sense that their relationship of love has been, if not terminally eradicated, certainly temporarily destroyed. God appears to them and offers his gentle voice of welcoming return at the cool of the day. Simeon advises that God searches for the Edenic couple because he loves them, and God was not angry with them, nor did he immediately turn away from them. But he also adds on God's behalf, do you think you can hide from me? God's question to Eve, what is this you have done, gives her the opportunity to admit her and Adam's fault. As the Orthodox Lenten Vespers state, then the Saviour said to them, I do not desire the loss of the creature I formed, but that he should be saved and come to the knowledge of the truth. For he who comes to me, I will not drive away. Instead, Adam and Eve hid and did not confess their guilt. Psalm 32 verse 5 identifies a way forward, as many biblical references do, after wrongdoing, and the encouragement to acknowledge my sin to thee, I did not hide my iniquity. I will confess my transgression to the Lord, then thou didst forgive the guilt of my sin. And a little later in the same psalm is added, thou art my hiding place. After sin, the place to hide is within the divine folds of love. Adam and Eve did not take advantage of this possibility of forgiveness. Luther, who I think is extremely insightful on this text, writes that Adam and Eve's hiding after the fall, seeing it as a deliberate hiding from God, they tremble at the sound of a shaking leaf. This fleeing from God is therefore the strongest possible testimony of Adam against himself. Oh, how awful a fall, to fall from the safest security and delight in God into fear and dread. For it is not the devil from whom Adam and Eve are now fleeing, they are rushing from the sight of God, their creator. This dread, therefore, is actually a flight from and a hatred of God himself, writes Luther. And now we come on to the implications for the fall of Catholic education, which I've contextualized within England and the experience of education over the past 30 to 40 years in England and Wales, but I think it will reverberate across borders. And this is quite a long section in the article, but I'll just pick out 3 or 4 key points and suggest that Catholic education is susceptible to a fall in a context which is very counter to what its philosophy of education is about. Ryan Wilson became a qualified English secondary teacher in 2005. From the age of 8, living in Northern Ireland, he had dreamed of becoming a teacher. His autobiographical narrative of his professional life, working in Essex and London after gaining a degree in English literature at Oxford University, captures something, I think, and is representative of the climate that now exists in schools and colleges. Certainly, for him, a debilitating system to which Catholic educators, I think, like everyone else, are likely to fall victim. He left the profession at the age of 32, but writes that he hopes to return to the classroom one day because he loves teaching so much. He writes that over 10 years, and by the time he was in senior management, and he was clearly a very talented teacher and manager, the pressure had ratcheted up from government level, and the overriding emphasis on examination results was enormous, which coincided with budgets being cut. One of the reasons for writing his book was because it was important that people, he said, became aware of the pressure Ofsted, the inspectors, put on those involved in education. It passed on to head teachers, because their jobs lived or died by examination results they got, and the pressure then stepped down to leadership teams, to heads of department, to teachers, and inevitably on to pupils. Seems to me enormous pressure, particularly during the pandemic, that pupils facing GCSE and A-level are under at the moment. And I think Ofsted have added to this pressure rather than relieved it. There's a real sense, writes Ryan, that Ofsted would look at the data, make a judgment on your school simply on the basis of examination results, even before they arrived. This is where, he says, a culture of fear came in, and why thousands of teachers have been leaving the profession within 5 years of qualifying, certainly in England and Wales. Catholic educators are not exempt from governmental initiatives and educational thinking, whose philosophy is clearly at odds with the Catholic philosophy of education. I'm suggesting that they are likely to fall victim to these irresistible forces unless they take a very committed stance. Unsurprisingly, feelings of guilt and shame arise among Catholic teachers as they capitulate to a system that has very little room for the promotion of creativity and for the fostering of spiritual moral growth in students, and which measures success by the number of students they get to achieve top grades, GCSE and A-level, and who move on to so-called Russell Group University and high prestige apprenticeships, where happiness will be open to them due to their high salaries. Leading philosophers and sociologists, and I'll end on this, argue that educators have to guard against two main enemies, neoliberalism and globalization. These influences are characterized by the overwhelming impact of the market, the justification of educational expenditure on education only when it secures economic benefit, the operation of a consumer choice mechanism, the emphasis on competition, the drift to commodification, all leading to the conclusion that educational theories are now founded upon a monetary paradigm, a human capital theory which dehumanizes the entire project, which is deeply at odds with the Genesis teaching about Imago Dei. Senior teachers and teachers new to the profession, sometimes unknowingly influenced by policies and practices which are in direct tension with a Christian philosophy of education, witnessed in Genesis 1 and 3, do slide, I think, sometimes towards pride, self-autonomy, consumerism, highlight the shameful hiding of these dangers under a veil of accountability and institutional survival. The idols that start to be worshipped in this situation reflect the idyllic couple's susceptibilities and failings. Christian higher education has not escaped these influences, which undermine a confident sharing of a clear Christian vision for education and society. As Furlong bluntly puts it, Newman is dead, and his vision of the cultivation of the mind, which is worth seeking for its own sake, and which is itself a treasure, has become extinct. He concludes, overall, this is a very different world from the financially secure, self-governing community of scholars dedicated to the pursuit of truth that used to exist. And I'm conscious of the time, Trish, so I'll just read my final paragraph. Catholic schools presently operate demands that senior management teams, staff members and students alike are driven to achieve examination and employment success as their primary aim, based on a system of intense managerialism, an obsession with data, endless inspections, competitive league tables, all of which contribute to producing high levels of stress for all those involved. It also entails the leaving of the profession by droves of teachers on moral and health grounds. Ryan Wilson's story is emblematic of one of thousands. Not surprisingly, mental health issues become rife in such a climate, and the temptation to succumb and to agree to this destructive system is immensely strong. The fruit is sometimes just too inviting, since professional worth, inverted commas, and reputation rest upon this pact with the devil. That's strong language, I think. Genesis 3:1-18 offers a warning about the consequences of such a potential fall. Feelings of guilt, alienation and shame within professionals as they agree to what they know in their hearts through their experience and knowledge to be a very reductionist and damaging understanding and practice of education. Masaccio's painting of the expulsion is a vivid visual reminder for all time of succumbing to the lure of insidious and dangerous attractions and the dire consequences of such capitulation. Nevertheless, the narrative does offer hope towards the end. If you do fall, do not hide your mistake. Rather, admit your capitulation and seek forgiveness. A position, unfortunately, Adam and Eve were unable to adopt. Thank you.